All right, we're into week 2 of our class on the New Testament's use of the Old Testament, and we're diving into Longenecker's book this week, Biblical Exegesis in the Apostolic Period. Hopefully, you've got the second edition. That's what we're going to be using. And man, I know, I get it. The copyright date on this is from the 90s, which is apparently ancient these days, which is weird. A couple reasons why I wanted us to have this book in our class is because I'm intentionally trying to move progressively through our minds and our understanding of the New Testament traditional interpretation of the Old Testament to help us ease into the idea that the New Testament authors, the apostles, thought differently than we did. I've got a timeline up here on my my office, and as you can see, this timeline, we start over here at 0. We see Jerome, Marcion, all that stuff. But what really pivots for me is what happens here in the 1500s is the Renaissance, which bleeds into the Enlightenment, where rationalism pops up, and so everything has to be systematized and analyzed and processed with some kind of scientific accuracy. And so we start studying the Bible. Well, then, of course, the Gutenberg printing press happens right over here too, where the Gutenberg Bible, Luther's translation of the Bibles, why the Gutenberg printing press gets its name. So then everything is text, and not just written text, not just scribal text, but now we have this text that is set, and any kind of alteration of that text is now an error. It's not a traditional use of words with memory variants, but now we have perfect text printed the same way all the time, and so any difference is just a mistake. And that is just nothing like what the New Testament authors process. They have no context for that kind of approach to text or their traditions or to truth. And so I'm trying to progress us through this. We've processed through how oral traditional cultures worked in the past and still work in living oral traditional cultures today, which is why we have a whole orality movement in the mission field of how to um, deliver the gospel to oral preference learners. Stark itself is starting a track for a certificate level of a certificate in orality studies. And so yeah, I'm helping us slowly understand that there are other ways to see scripture and truth and to process text outside of what we just kind of assume is the way and the only way. A great word for us is when we think that our approach to truth is the only way to see truth. Our approach to reality is the only way to see reality. It's called ethnocentrism, where you think that your culture is the only true culture, the only culture that has any beat on truth, and all the other cultures just need to conform to yours. Now, listen, I just want you to know I am completely, fully aware of the hypocrisy of studying oral traditional cultures and ancient cultures through our modern scientific lens. Of the irony of writing a book and having it printed through a printer on how orality works. But here we are. This is how we know to think. And so let's think the way that we think in ways that helps us validate the other ways that other people thought and think. Right. So this does a good job of introducing us to what is still considered to be a good perspective on exegetical methods of the apostolic era. And you'll hear from Longenecker even in this second edition that that some of these categories are like we shouldn't see them as chiseled in stone. That the exegetes of the apostolic era weren't like, hey, which exegetical method am I going to use today? With the same kind of labels on them. It was just we're trying to put labels on uh, um, processes and approaches to text that we can see um, in how they interpret the text from, midrashic, um, rabbinic literature, Second Temple literature, and things like that. Also, there's just a lot of really good data sets to pull from this book. You'll see tables of clear quotations from the Old Testament and different New Testament books. And so I pulled this was a great book for me when I to help me realize, the depth of the traditional material in the book of Romans that over half of over half of Paul's clear Old Testament quotations are in the book of Romans, while the book of Romans is only like 22% of all of Paul's writings. And that over half of the quotations in Romans are just in the three chapters of Romans 9 through 11. And so 30% of all of Paul's Old Testament quotations are in the three chapters of Romans 9 through 11. That was data that I pulled from here. He also has some great perspectives on Jesus's use of the Old Testament, some great words on how, uh, you know, there are some times when Jesus quotes the Old Testament that, and by sometimes I think there's like two or three, maybe four that he listed here, where Jesus's interpretation is kind of dependent on the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And so there's really good discussion in here. So I know this isn't from the 90s, but it has aged pretty well, and a good reason besides just some of the data sets that Longenecker lists here that's really good to have access to even after this class is it's also a great way to open our minds to the idea, the fact that the apostles did not think of interpreting scripture exactly the way that we do. Didn't see the text exactly the way that we do. And so these first two books that we're going through are really just if I can just open up our minds some to understand that the New Testament authors, tradition bearers, did not even consider that they were pivoting from a normal way of interpreting scripture when they interpreted it the way they did. That they did not have this historical, grammatical, scientific approach to the text, but they had this traditional, ancient Jewish, Middle Eastern approach to the text. I think that'll be that. Just being aware of that will help us navigate our interpretation of the New Testament as we look at their interpretation of the Old Testament, and then we try to proclaim that to our own hearts and our own relationships with Christ, and to whatever congregation or ministry or Sunday school class or whatever that we serve.